June 1944, the northern coast of France. The largest amphibious invasion in military history had just unfolded on the beaches of Normandy. Within weeks, the Allied forces had established a foothold that stretched nearly 50 miles inland. Behind this monumental military advance lay an achievement even more astonishing: a supply operation of such scale and efficiency that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe the reports they received. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Elise Montgomery stood on the deck of the Liberty ship as it approached the artificial harbor at Mulberry B off Gold Beach. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the enormous concrete structures that formed the breakwater of this engineering marvel. As the ship's engines throttled back, she studied the bustling activity below. Hundreds of supply vehicles moved in organized chaos along the floating piers, transferring thousands of tons of supplies from ships to shore. Quite the operation, wouldn't you say, Colonel? Captain Richards approached, offering her a steaming cup of coffee. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen," Montgomery replied, accepting the mug gratefully. The steam warmed her face against the cool channel breeze. 3 weeks ago, this was just open water. As the Army's senior logistics officer assigned to SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Montgomery had helped plan this massive supply operation for over a year. Now she was here to witness its execution firsthand. The success of the entire invasion depended on her team's ability to keep the advancing forces supplied with everything from bullets to bandages, from fuel to food. "The Germans never believed we could do this," she said, almost to herself. "Their intelligence reports from '43 dismissed our logistics capabilities. They calculated we'd need at least 3 established deepwater ports to support an invasion of this size." Richards nodded. "And instead, we brought our own ports." The artificial harbors at Mulberry A and B represented just one component of the most ambitious military logistics operation in history. Each day, these floating harbors processed over 12,000 tons of supplies and 2,500 vehicles. In the distance, Montgomery could see the endless stream of landing craft shuttling between ships and shore, the mechanized ballet of cranes loading and unloading, and the convoys of trucks departing for the front lines. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had once famously said, "The battle is fought and decided by the quartermasters before the shooting begins." As Montgomery watched the operation unfold below, she knew Rommel had been right. The shooting had begun on June 6th, but the battle had already been decided in the planning rooms of Portsmouth and London, where logistics officers like her had worked tirelessly to ensure that Allied forces would never lack the supplies they needed to keep advancing. What Montgomery couldn't know then was how profoundly the German High Command had underestimated Allied logistical capabilities, particularly regarding fuel supply. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most consequential errors of the entire war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The story begins not with triumph, but with skepticism. When initial intelligence about Allied supply plans reached German analysts in early 1944, the response was dismissive. The requirement for fuel alone seemed impossible to meet. German logistics officers calculated that a major offensive operation would require approximately 800,000 gallons of fuel daily. Moving this volume across the English Channel under combat conditions without established harbor facilities was deemed logistically impossible. One intelligence report from February 1944 described the Allied supply plan as fantastic and unrealistic. German military planners who had spent years developing their own logistics doctrine could not conceive of how the Allies planned to fuel a major offensive across the English Channel. The report concluded that any invasion attempt would rapidly stall due to inadequate supply lines. Montgomery had been present when that very German intelligence report was placed on General Eisenhower's desk, captured during a raid on a German listening post in neutral Spain. She remembered Eisenhower's response vividly. "Their disbelief is our greatest advantage." The Germans had confidence in their own assessments. Their logistics experts were among the finest military minds in Europe, many with experience dating back to the First World War. They had successfully supplied German armies across thousands of miles of the Russian front. Surely they understood the limitations of military supply operations better than anyone. This confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. The American-led supply operation was not a conventional military logistics system. It represented something entirely new, the application of industrial mass production principles to military supply chains. 2 days after arriving in Normandy, Montgomery stood in a newly established fuel depot 5 miles inland from Gold Beach. Before her stretched row upon row of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of fuel. The depot held over 500,000 gallons, enough to support an armored division for several days of heavy combat operations. And this was just one of dozens of similar depots being established across the beachhead. "We're bringing in over 1 million gallons per day now," explained Major Sarah Jennings, the depot commander. "By next week, we'll hit 2 million. Montgomery knew these figures would be considered impossible by German logistics planners. Their entire fuel allocation for the Western Front had rarely exceeded 300,000 gallons daily, spread across multiple armies. "And the pipeline?" Montgomery asked. "Pluto is ahead of schedule," Jennings replied, referring to the pipeline under the ocean system. "The first line will be operational within days. Once all lines are active, we'll pump over 1 million gallons directly from England every day." The Pluto system represented something German engineers had never attempted, a submarine pipeline capable of delivering fuel directly from England to France, eliminating the need for vulnerable tanker ships. The concept had been dismissed by German intelligence as technically unfeasible. Yet within weeks of the invasion, fuel would flow through these underwater arteries, feeding the Allied advance across France. If harbors were damaged, beach landings could continue. If beach landings became impossible, air transport could deliver emergency supplies. The Germans built a supply system designed to work perfectly, Montgomery explained to a group of newly arrived logistics officers. "We built one designed to work even when damaged or operating at reduced capacity." This philosophy extended beyond fuel to every aspect of the supply operation. The result was a logistics system of unprecedented resilience, capable of absorbing damage and adapting to changing battlefield conditions. The first captured German officers arrived for interrogation in mid-June, barely a week after D-Day. Montgomery attended several of these sessions, interested in how German commanders perceived the Allied supply operation. Major Klaus Werner, captured near Caen on June 12, expressed disbelief when shown the actual supply figures. "These numbers cannot be accurate," he insisted. "Our intelligence indicated you would struggle to land even 5,000 tons daily across all beaches combined. You claimed to be landing over 20,000 tons." "The figures are accurate, Major," Montgomery replied. "In fact, they're conservative. Yesterday, we processed 23,500 tons. Werner shook his head. "It's not possible. The infrastructure requirements alone would—" "We brought our infrastructure with us," Montgomery interrupted, sliding photographs of the Mulberry harbors across the table. Werner studied the images in silence, his expression shifting from skepticism to dawning comprehension. "My God," he whispered finally, "we never considered that you would build portable harbors." Similar scenes played out in interrogation rooms across Normandy as captured German officers confronted the reality of Allied logistics capabilities. Their training had prepared them for conventional military challenges, but not for the industrial scale of American supply operations. By late June, the implications were becoming clear to German high command.
Field Marshal Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, sent an urgent message to Hitler's headquarters. The enemy's superiority in supply is overwhelming. They can replace equipment faster than we can destroy it. Unless we can disrupt their supply lines, defeat is inevitable. Rommel's assessment was correct, but his recommendation came too late. The Allied buildup had already reached critical mass. Even if German forces could temporarily disrupt supply operations, the stockpiles already ashore would sustain combat operations for weeks. The most dramatic evidence of Allied supply superiority came in the realm of fuel. German units in Normandy were on strict fuel rationing from the first day of the invasion. Mechanical vehicles received just enough fuel for immediate operations, with little reserve. Mechanical breakdowns often couldn't be repaired because spare parts were unavailable. By contrast, Allied units operated with abundant fuel reserves and comprehensive spare parts inventories. Captain Hans Schroeder, a German tank commander captured near Saint-Lô, described the disparity bitterly during his interrogation. "My Panthers sat immobilized due to fuel shortages, while American Sherman tanks drove circles around us. We had superior machines, but could not move them. What good is a tank that cannot advance or retreat?" Montgomery encountered Schroeder's testimony in an intelligence summary and recognized it as a perfect encapsulation of the strategic advantage created by the Allied logistics system. German tanks, technically superior in many respects, were rendered ineffective by supply constraints.
American tanks, though less heavily armored, remained continuously operational. This pattern repeated across every aspect of the battlefield. German artillery units rationed ammunition while Allied guns fired without restriction. German infantry conserved grenades and small arms ammunition while Allied soldiers used suppressive fire liberally. German aircraft carefully planned minimal sorties while Allied planes flew continuous missions. By July 1944, the evidence of Allied logistical superiority had become impossible for German high command to ignore. Intelligence assessments shifted dramatically. What had been dismissed as impossible in February was now recognized as an unprecedented achievement and an existential threat to German forces in France. A captured intelligence report dated July 15, 1944, reached conclusions starkly different from earlier assessments. The American supply system represents an entirely new approach to military logistics. They have effectively industrialized the battlefield, applying mass production techniques to supply operations. Their system prioritizes volume and redundancy over efficiency. The result is crude but enormously effective. Montgomery read this assessment with satisfaction. Crude but enormously effective perfectly captured the philosophy that had guided her team's planning. They had deliberately sacrificed elegance for reliability, efficiency for capacity. Where German logistics officers sought to calculate exact requirements and meet them precisely, Montgomery and her colleagues had simply overwhelmed the problem with resources. "If one truck breaks down, send 3 more," she had instructed her officers repeatedly. "If one route is blocked, establish 5 alternatives. If one supply dump is destroyed, have 3 others ready." This approach horrified German logistics experts, who considered it wasteful and inefficient. But as July turned to August, the results spoke for themselves. The Allied armies continued their relentless advance across France, never lacking the fuel, ammunition, or equipment needed to maintain momentum. The contrast with German logistics became increasingly stark. By August 1944, German units were cannibalizing damaged vehicles for spare parts, converting gasoline engines to run on alcohol when fuel ran short, and carefully counting individual artillery shells before authorizing fire missions. Oberstleutnant Ingrid Hoffmann, a German logistics officer captured near Falaise, provided perhaps the most insightful assessment during her interrogation. "We designed our supply system for the army we had. You designed yours for the army you could build. The difference is philosophical, not merely technical." Montgomery quoted Hoffmann's observation in her reports to SHAEF headquarters. It captured the fundamental distinction between German and Allied approaches to war.
one bound by present limitations, the other focused on future potential. As the Allied breakout from Normandy gained momentum in August 1944, fuel consumption reached levels that would have been deemed impossible during the planning phase. Patton's Third Army alone consumed over 350,000 gallons daily as it raced across France. Rather than constraining his advance, Montgomery's logistics teams simply ramped up delivery. "If Patton can maintain this pace, we'll keep his tanks rolling," she promised Eisenhower during a staff meeting in newly liberated Cherbourg.
"We've established forward airfields specifically to deliver fuel. If the trucks can't reach them, planes will drop jerry cans directly to his advancing columns." This flexibility represented another advantage over German logistics, which remained rigidly hierarchical. When German commanders exceeded fuel allocations, they faced reprimands and restrictions. When American commanders pushed beyond planned supply lines, logistics officers improvised solutions to support their initiative. The culmination of the Allied logistics triumph came during what became known as the Red Ball Express, a continuous convoy system that delivered supplies from the Normandy beaches to the rapidly advancing front lines. At its peak in August 1944, over 6,000 trucks operated continuously on the Red Ball route, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Many drivers were African-American soldiers who worked tirelessly, often completing multiple round trips with minimal rest. Montgomery visited a Red Ball staging area near St. Lo in mid-August. Hundreds of trucks were being loaded simultaneously, a carefully choreographed operation that resembled an assembly line more than a traditional military depot. Drivers received sealed orders, specific routes, and strict instructions about speed and convoy discipline. "How many round trips have you made this week?" Montgomery asked one exhausted driver as he climbed into his cab. "This will be my 14th, ma'am," he replied. "We're averaging 20 hours on the road daily. It's brutal, but we know the boys at the front need what we're carrying." That dedication, multiplied across thousands of drivers, mechanics, depot workers, and logistics planners, created something unprecedented in military history, and supply system that expanded rather than constrained operational possibilities. Instead of generals planning campaigns around logistics limitations, logistics officers found ways to support whatever advance commanders believed possible. The German High Command had initially dismissed the Allied supply operations as impossible, but by August 1944, their assessments had shifted dramatically. Captured documents revealed a growing alarm as German intelligence officers struggled to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. One report, marked Most Urgent and dated August 10, 1944, concluded, "The American supply system operates on principles fundamentally different from our own. They have effectively industrialized logistics, treating it as a manufacturing challenge rather than a military one." This observation captured the essence of what made the Allied and particularly American approach so revolutionary. Montgomery knew that many of her counterparts came not from military backgrounds, but from civilian industries. The head of petroleum operations had previously managed distribution for Standard Oil. The chief transportation officer had run operations for the Pennsylvania Railroad. The officer responsible for maintenance systems had been an executive at General Motors. "We didn't approach this as soldiers," Montgomery explained to a group of war correspondents touring the Normandy supply operations in late August. "We approached it as industrialists who happened to be wearing uniforms." This industrial mindset manifested most visibly in the standardization of equipment and procedures. Where German logistics relied on a bewildering variety of vehicles, containers, and equipment, each requiring specific parts and specialized maintenance, the Allied system standardized aggressively. Fuel came in identical 5-gallon jerry cans, ironically adapted from a German design but mass-produced in unprecedented quantities.
Over 21 million jerry cans were manufactured for the invasion, creating a universal fuel container that could be handled by any soldier and transported by any vehicle. Ammunition arrived in standardized boxes, with color-coded markings visible from a distance. Medical supplies used a universal packing system that allowed field hospitals to restock without complex inventories. The transportation network showed similar standardization. The 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half truck became the workhorse of the Allied logistics system, with over 562,000 built during the war. Parts were interchangeable, maintenance procedures were identical, and drivers trained on one vehicle could operate any other of the same type. A German supply column might include a dozen different vehicle types, each requiring specific parts and specialized mechanics, Montgomery noted during a staff briefing. Our columns use standardized vehicles with interchangeable components. When a truck breaks down, we can cannibalize parts from another or replace it entirely within minutes. This standardization created enormous efficiency advantages. German maintenance units needed extensive inventories of parts for diverse vehicles. Allied maintenance units carried a smaller range of components that could service a larger number of standardized vehicles. The result was fewer vehicles immobilized by lack of spare parts. Colonel Friedrich Schultz, a German logistics officer captured near Paris in late August, perhaps summarized it best during his interrogation. "Your supply system is not elegant, but it is brutally effective. We designed precise systems that function perfectly until damaged. You designed redundant systems that function adequately even when half destroyed." Montgomery kept a transcript of Schultz's assessment on her desk as a reminder of the philosophy that guided Allied logistics planning. Precision and elegance mattered less than functionality under combat conditions. Redundancy trumped efficiency. Volume overcame friction. By September 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, the full impact of this logistics revolution became apparent. In a conventional military assessment, the Allied advance should have stalled as supply lines stretched beyond sustainable limits. German planners had calculated that Allied forces would reach their logistical culminating point, the maximum distance at which they could maintain adequate supply, somewhere near the Seine River, roughly 100 miles inland from the Normandy beaches. Instead, Allied forces pushed nearly 500 miles inland, maintaining offensive operations far beyond what German logistics officers had deemed possible. This achievement resulted from innovations that fundamentally reimagined military supply operations. Perhaps the most dramatic of these innovations was the Pluto pipeline system, which began operation in August 1944. Initial skepticism about the feasibility of underwater pipelines gave way to astonishment as fuel began flowing directly from England to France through multiple submarine lines. By September, Pluto delivered over 1 million gallons of fuel daily, more than the entire daily allocation for German forces on the Western Front. Montgomery visited one of the Pluto terminal stations near Cherbourg in mid-September. The facility resembled an industrial pumping station more than a military installation. Massive pumps drove fuel through the underwater pipelines at pressures that would have been considered impossible in pre-war technology.
Engineering. The Germans never believed this could work, explained Commander Elizabeth Reynolds, the naval engineer overseeing the operation. Their calculations showed that pressure losses over this distance would make the system ineffective. What they failed to consider was that we'd simply use bigger pumps and more powerful motors than anyone had previously attempted. This willingness to exceed conventional limitations characterized the entire Allied logistics approach. When standard transportation methods proved insufficient, innovative solutions emerged. When roads became congested, engineers built new ones. When existing rail lines couldn't handle the volume, specialized units repaired damaged tracks and constructed new spurs. When even these measures fell short, air transport supplemented ground convoys. By October 1944, the logistics system supporting Allied forces included over 5,000 miles of newly laid pipeline,
4,000 miles of repaired or newly constructed railways, and 500 miles of military highways. This infrastructure, built while combat operations continued, represented an engineering achievement that German observers struggled to comprehend. Oberstleutnant Werner Hoffmann, head of logistics for a panzer division captured near the Belgian border, expressed this incredulity during his interrogation. "We expected your advance to halt for weeks while you established supply lines. Instead, your supply infrastructure seems to advance alongside your combat units. We cannot understand how this is possible." The answer lay partly in specialized units that German forces lacked. The U.S. Army had created dedicated pipeline construction battalions, railway operating companies, and road construction units, often staffed by soldiers with civilian experience in these industries. These specialized units worked immediately behind the advancing front, establishing supply infrastructure almost as quickly as combat units secured territory. This capability created a cascading advantage. Conventional military doctrine held that offensive operations must periodically pause to allow supply lines to catch up. These operational pauses gave defenders time to regroup and establish new defensive positions. Allied forces in 1944 largely eliminated these pauses, maintaining continuous pressure on retreating German units. German commanders repeatedly attempted to establish defensive lines, only to find Allied forces arriving before defenses could be properly organized. This relentless pressure resulted directly from the logistics system's ability to sustain continuous offensive operations without significant pauses. By November 1944, as Allied forces prepared to enter Germany itself, the contrast between opposing logistic systems had become stark. German units relied increasingly on horse-drawn transport as fuel shortages immobilized vehicles. Ammunition shortages forced strict rationing for artillery and heavy weapons. Spare parts became so scarce that mechanics resorted to manufacturing components by hand. Meanwhile, Allied supply depots held abundant reserves of every critical item. Ammunition expenditure exceeded pre-invasion planning estimates by over 40%, yet shortages never materialized. Fuel consumption reached levels that would have paralyzed any previous military campaign, but supplies remained adequate. Even as winter approached, specialized winter equipment, from antifreeze to snow chains to winter uniforms, arrived at the front in massive quantities.
This abundance created tactical and operational flexibility that German commanders could not match. When opportunities emerged, Allied units could exploit them immediately without waiting for supply authorization. When German counterattacks threatened, Allied units could respond with overwhelming firepower without ammunition constraints. The culmination of the Allied logistics triumph came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The German offensive initially disrupted Allied supply lines, creating temporary shortages in forward areas. But the redundancy built into the system proved decisive. When primary supply routes were cut, secondary and tertiary routes activated. When truck convoys couldn't reach isolated units, airdrops delivered critical supplies. When fuel shortages threatened to immobilize reinforcements, emergency deliveries arrived via innovative methods, including jerrycans strapped to tanks rushing toward the front. Montgomery visited the headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne during the siege, arriving on one of the supply flights that broke through German lines. The scene impressed her deeply. Despite being surrounded, the division maintained combat operations with carefully managed but adequate supplies. Artillery fired support missions. Vehicles continued to operate. Wounded received treatment. All this occurred despite the division being completely cut off from ground supply lines for over a week. "This is the ultimate validation of our planning," she told General McAuliffe, the division commander. "You're surrounded, cut off from conventional supply, in the middle of winter, yet still combat effective." McAuliffe, who had famously replied, "nuts," to a German surrender demand, nodded grimly. The difference between defeat and victory often comes down to beans, bullets, and bandages. Right now, we have enough of all three.
The flexibility that allowed surrounded units to continue fighting reflected years of logistics planning. Every unit trained to operate temporarily without external supply. Every supply officer learned to prioritize critical items when shortages occurred. Every commander understood how to manage resources during isolation. This training proved as important as the physical supply system itself. The most abundant supplies were useless without the knowledge to distribute and use them effectively. Throughout the campaign, Montgomery had emphasized that logistics was not merely about delivering supplies, it was about delivering the right supplies to the right place at the right time. As 1944 drew to a close, German assessments of Allied logistics capabilities had undergone a complete reversal. From initial dismissal and skepticism, German intelligence reports now describe the American supply system with terms approaching awe. One December 1944 analysis, captured in January 1945, concluded, "The American ability to sustain offensive operations continuously without operational pauses represents a revolution in warfare. Future conflicts will be dominated by nations with similar industrial and logistical capabilities." This assessment proved prophetic. After World War II, military doctrine worldwide shifted to emphasize logistics as a central element of planning rather than an afterthought. The concept of tooth-to-tail ratio, the balance between combat and support forces, received renewed attention. Military planners recognized that combat power derived not just from weapons and tactics, but from the systems that sustained them. For Montgomery, the most significant lesson emerged during a conversation with a captured German general in early 1945. Asked what had most surprised him about American operations, he replied without hesitation, "Your absolute refusal to accept conventional limitations. When we calculated that something was impossible, we sought alternatives. When you calculated that something was impossible, you simply changed the underlying conditions until it became possible." This philosophical difference explained much about the respective approaches to military logistics. German planners accepted certain constraints as immutable: port capacity, transport distances, fuel consumption rates, and designed systems within those constraints. American planners treated the same factors as challenges to be overcome through innovation and industrial capacity. The Pluto pipeline exemplified this approach. Conventional engineering calculations indicated that pumping fuel through underwater pipelines across the English Channel would require pressures beyond the capability of available materials. Rather than accepting this limitation, Allied engineers simply designed stronger materials, more powerful pumps, and innovative couplings. They changed the parameters of what was possible. Similarly, when calculating the number of trucks required to support advancing armies, logisticians determined that the requirement exceeded available production capacity. The solution was not to scale back operational plans, but to increase production, streamline designs, simplify maintenance, and improve efficiency. Factory output of military trucks increased from hundreds to thousands per month, then from thousands to tens of thousands. This refusal to accept conventional limitations transformed military logistics from a constraining factor to an enabling one. Throughout history, armies had designed campaigns around what their supply systems could support. The Allied forces in 1944-45 inverted this relationship, designing supply systems around what their campaigns required. The implications extended far beyond military operations. The same principles that revolutionized military logistics, standardization, redundancy, scale, and innovation, subsequently transformed civilian industries. Veterans who had managed supply operations during the war applied similar approaches to post-war businesses. Companies that had manufactured military equipment adapted their production methods for civilian goods. The result was an economic transformation as profound as the military one. Just as Allied logistics had overwhelmed German military capabilities, American industrial capacity would reshape the global economy in the decades following the war. The ability to mass-produce standardized goods, distribute them efficiently, and constantly innovate processes became defining characteristics of the post-war economic order. For Montgomery, watching Germany surrender in May 1945, the connection between logistics and strategic victory seemed obvious. The fighting had been won not just by soldiers at the front, but by an immense support system that stretched from the battlefields of Europe back to factories in America. The German military studied tactics and strategy for generations, she wrote in her final report to SHAEF headquarters.
They created a formidable fighting force capable of defeating any opponent in direct combat. What they failed to recognize was that modern warfare is not decided by combat alone, but by the industrial and logistical systems that sustain it. This insight, that wars are won by systems as much as by soldiers, represented the enduring legacy of the Allied logistics revolution. Future conflicts would be shaped by this understanding, with military planners giving unprecedented attention to the unglamorous but essential task of moving supplies from factories to fighting units. The humble jerrycan, the standardized truck, the prefabricated harbor, the underwater pipeline, these proved as decisive as any weapon system. The German officers who initially laughed at American logistics plans ended the war in astonished recognition that they had witnessed something revolutionary, an approach to warfare that fundamentally changed what was possible on the battlefield. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.